I think I would like to start talking about this thing that I've just realized in the last 2 days while talking here, that I personally, as a journalist, and many other journalists, have failed big time in telling the story of ISIS. Partly because ISIS have managed to, have a monopoly on the way they tell their story. Okay, if I talk too much about politics and ISIS, you can just change the subject and I will start talking about kittens and everything. But if you see the story, if what we know now about the Islamic State in terms of journalism, everything we know is they have told us. We haven't been able to go there. We can't go there. They've managed to terrorize, kill, kidnap the journalist. So they have a monopoly on the story that we know is not different from the, say, North Korean monopoly or anyone else's monopoly. And of course, you have the biggest debate now it's happening in the journalist community is, do we go into Syria? Do we try to tell the story from there, or we don't? If we don't go to Syria, we end up basically not knowing what's happening, basically dependent on Twitter and Facebook to do the reporting for us, which is not very good, which is not enough to tell the story. But if you, a journalist, you decide to go into Syria, then you have to think of the risk of kidnapping. And that is, suddenly the journalists are becoming the story themselves. They are becoming killed and kidnapped. Now, what is the balance between these two things? I personally, I don't know the balance. I always have managed to find this tiny little corner where I can go, whether South Yemen, whether Al-Qaeda here, whether the Afghanistan, whether Taliban and all these. Always as a journalist, you can find an opening. And it's not different whether you're trying to tell the story of okay. As a journalist, when you want trying to tell a story of, say, a group of people, let's say gangsters in the streets of Amsterdam, let's say smugglers in the streets of, I don't know, Istanbul, or Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, you always approach these groups in the same way. You try to find someone who knows someone who introduces you and start opening the gap. And you also build this network of safety, someone who will come and get you if you're in trouble, this someone. All these measures have collapsed now with Syria, with ISIS. There is no one who can get you out. And that takes us back to the origin problem. How can you tell the story of Syria? So this is where we are at the moment. We are being, again, going into another conflict in the Middle East. Good conflict, bad conflict, I don't know, but it is a conflict, and it is a conflict uninformed. There are two sides of this conflict, of course. There is the humanitarian side. We've seen what's happened in northern Iraq and northern Syria, the Kurdish community, the Yazidis, all these things, we've seen it. But also, how do you tackle, the biggest issue? How do you deal with Islamic State in Iraq? Is it a new phenomenon? Is it like the Taliban in Afghanistan? Do we bomb them? Do we not bomb them? And most importantly, as a journalist, how do you tell that kind of story? So, with all my big heart, I say, I don't know. This is such a new way of a new story, and it has two sides. So if we go back to the original comparison to, say, North Korea, the North Koreans, they're not interested in you, and they're not telling you their version of the story, and they don't want you to tell their versions. It's a closed society. Other countries to a certain extent. IS, on the other hand, is the most aggressive media organization functioning now in the Middle East, and the most successful media organization now in the Middle East. I don't know if you follow their Twitter or YouTube or magazines, or they're doing a job beyond what the Iraqi government, the Syrian government, or any other government in the Middle East are doing. So again, as a journalist, how do you tell that story? And how do you, it's very easy to go into this narrative of black and white. Here is the Islamic State, they're evil people, and here is the thing, and that's the good people. But how do you you know, the Middle East is not black and white. The Middle East is like 1,000 shades of gray between one thing to the other. How do you go around and tell that story? I mean, I keep asking these questions because I don't know the answer. Because all my way of trying to tell that story, you know, have reached a point and I've stopped. So I would like to open this debate or this question now about how do we go about and tell the story of the Middle East at the moment. So, you've been in Iraq lately.
Yes.
Tell us.
Well, I've been only in the Kurdish side, so it's a narrow story then as well. And it's very one-sided in that aspect because the tensions around the Middle East, so different people, they choose to only stick to a certain side of the story, I think. But what I've seen is a lot of refugee, the refugee crisis, humanitarian crisis, tensions rising between minorities and the majority. Yes,
which the refugee crisis is another one of these dilemmas if you work in journalism that you have to deal with. You know, it's a very hard story. I mean, you've seen the conditions of the people. It's really miserable. And as the UNHCR saying, this is the biggest number of refugees since the Second World War. This is a massive scale. But then your challenge as a journalist is, or the challenge for me at least, is how do you differentiate between the masses of refugees moving and between the general poverty in the Middle East. I mean, we've seen the pictures of refugees. They sit in these tiny little concrete rooms, but many people live in these concrete rooms. Poor people. I mean, how do you distinguish telling the story of Syrian refugee family in Lebanon and the story of a poor Lebanese family that's already living in Lebanon? You know, how do you separate the stories of each one of those individuals and how you try to tell it? How would you?
Not me.
Yes, seriously. No, how do you try to come out of these, you know, to tell the story of refugees in a way that is not repetitive of everything you've seen in the Middle East? Because one of the problems that journalists did is they reported certain conflicts, say Syria, in such a way that it led to, I don't know, the people don't want to read about Syria anymore because it's the same story again and again because people are being bombed, people are being killed, people are being, and then people, you know, stop reading your stories. So your other challenge in, you know, 90% of any of your stories would be the logistics. You know, how to go to a place and how to find the people and how to talk to the people. But then the 10%, which is the biggest challenge eventually, is how do you tell the story in a way that you don't just repeat everyone else's story, you know? And that is one of these, you know, big challenges, for example, in the conflict of Syria. You know, it's you go to a war zone, you've taken so much risk, you've survived so many, you know, basically you take your life on your hand and you go to Syria. And then you go there and you spend a week and you come back and you tell me a very typical story of, you have failed. You failed because, you know, no one would read, and that's the most important thing. And I've, you know, sometimes I would take these enormous risks to tell a story, but no one can read the risk. You know, I can't tell the people again and again in my pieces, and I met Abu Ali and we sat in the car and we drove through the desert. That is not important. That is about me. That is not telling the story. So you think sometimes you, by the fact taking risk, that you've taken a risk, you can tell a great story. You're mistaken. And that's...
in preparation also for the lecture and things, I read a few of your articles also in The Guardian, and I noticed that the way you tell stories is very descriptive. You very much, and I think maybe that's a key element to really have a specific message, is by making it kind of tying in and the general fact of things that people do know with this human interest, which I feel like you managed to capture really well in your photos and then the writing that you use to kind of describe these photos. So I guess my question would be, I guess, do you think like, is that enough, or is that necessity, and is that how these articles are born, is because this is what you can get when you go, and this is the best way to portray the message you're trying to say?
In a way, I think, you know, my best attempts to write is when I can draw a picture. I am a photographer and a writer at the same time. So when I work as a photographer. So I take pictures when it's possible, of course. Sometimes it's not possible to get your camera. So I work as a photographer, and then I try to tell the story of that place and tell the issues that happened before and after the story. That is the biggest challenge, is how do you build a picture? How do you, find the family, find the tiny little details that kind of make a reader question himself. I mean, yesterday I was having a conversation with some journalists, and the editor, I think, was saying something very interesting. He said, I would like in the end of every piece, I don't answer the question, but I raise the question. And I think that will be the best role of a journalist, if you can actually, end of the piece, make your readers question everything. So you don't answer the question. You can't answer the question. I would be a fool if I thought I would write a piece about Syria and I would give the answer to, about Syria, and who am I? But if I can raise the questions, if I can question your beliefs. Martha Gellhorn, do you know Martha Gellhorn? Martha Gellhorn. Martha Gellhorn said, never trust the government. The government would always attempt to deceive you, so never trust this source of... different government, of course, Dutch government, Syrian government are not all government. So that is one of the things. So it's not only a government. What Martha Gellhorn was saying about governments is very accurate and true about everyone, because everyone has their own side of the story want to tell you. The Kurds want to tell you a side of the stories. The Arab would like to tell you a side of the stories. The Sunnis, the Shia, the tribes, everyone would like to tell a version of their story. How do you raise the questions is what I think is...
May I ask what kind of questions you want to raise then?
Questioning a status quo. It's questioning the narrative. There is a narrative now, which is, in the last 3 years, let's say in the Middle East, there was a narrative of what's happening. My role as a journalist, your role as a journalist, is to question that narrative, and especially you have a much more important role than I have. You can shape the debate in your countries. I come from Iraq, I write about Iraq, I write for my own, for the people in the West. But again, it's not my taxpayer money that is doing something else. For you, you are part of a society that is having so many questions. You should try to answer these questions. And I think it's your role. It's your taxpayer money. Please.
Especially after what you just said, a lot about the coverage of the Middle East, what ISIS now. It seems to be about finding the bigger picture, or the ground narrative of what's going on in geopolitics, and say IS and its geopolitics, or a Shia crescent shaping around Saudi Arabia and all. But at the same time, you already said that there's a story for every group, or every tribe even. So how do you go about going to a place, meeting and talking to the people, and then seeing what is local and what is part of the bigger story? How do you separate them and at the same time sometimes realize what is part of the same story?
I think you just answered the question. Instead of, no, seriously, instead of trying to sit and write this big narrative, or the big crescent, say the Shia crescent, the Sunni crescent, I don't know. But if you find this tiny little local corner, this tiny little point of conflict, and then if you describe that conflict, you will realize that all conflicts are in a way, not similar. They're different. So it's very easy to think that kind of all the Sunnis of Iraq and all the Shia of Iran are fighting one big war. This one here, this one there. In reality, it's not. It's very different, multiple conflicts, multiple wars. So your job, and it's not in one article, which is it's another mistake that I've sometimes committed. If you try to tell me a tiny little element of a conflict, then that would be a brilliant job. In South Yemen, there's a tiny little town called Ja'ar. Ja'ar, Aden in South Yemen. So 40 kilometers to the west of Aden. There is the town of Jar. Jar was under, Al-Qaeda started establishing presence in Jar by 2010, 2011. They ruled over Jar. By 2012, they, declared an Imara and an independent state, and then it collapsed, of course. There was a very radical, cleric and a radical society, and then there was a training camp of the jihadis on the mountain in Jar. Now, few years before that, few decades before that, South Yemen was a communist state, and it was the center of what was known then as an international red terrorism. And Carlos the Jackal, had a training camp in the same town, had a training, brought foreigners from, Germany, different places, and they were training on the same mountain that eventually, 50 years later, became a center of another form of radicalization and another. How do you tell that story? Is that story because there's something in the water of that town that makes people kind of radicalize, or there is something that's being built again and again throughout the history around that place? So that's one of the examples of how do you tell a bigger picture, by finding the tiny little spot. So in a way, Jar can tell you the story of the bigger conflict of radicalization in South Yemen, because it's always a conflict between the landlord and the peasant and something, for example. Please.
I guess this question's a bit straying away from what we've been asking so far, but when looking at it from a photographical standpoint, when you're out in the field and you're looking to capture a photo, what's the most important thing for you in terms of composition? Like, how do you ideally, decide that you're going to tell a story through a photo? What stands out when taking a photo?
I think the challenge, there are two, for me personally, I'm talking about me personally. I have two challenges. One is, how do you make destruction and death beautiful? Because you have to make it beautiful, because that's your job as a photographer. You need to present this thing in a composition. So when you're seeing, say, a dead man in the middle of the street in Aleppo, how do you take that picture and how do you compose it? Do you become honest to the fact that there is a dead man in the street and you have to show it to the world to see what's happening? Or do you want to make it beautiful? Compose it and work around the frame. Because I think the most ideal pictures, the perfect pictures, the Allah-made picture, is the picture that would suggest but wouldn't tell you the truth. But that is the perfect picture. So if you can suggest to me the destruction, the death, the whatever is happening without typically telling me that, these are the perfect pictures. So we go back to the refugee stories. And I think if you can tell me in your pictures about this family living there in a concrete shed, not by taking the picture of the woman sitting there with the water and the poverty, but if you can suggest the misery of their life and the beauty of their life in a way, that is... See, I think the editors and the journalists make a mistake by thinking the audience is stupid, or the people are bored. The people are not bored from a story, because throughout the history, people would love to listen to a story. I mean, we are storytellers. End of the day, we are storytellers. We tell a story. And people will always listen to you telling a story. It's the challenge, how do you stop being a boring journalist, telling me exactly the same picture? That's the challenge. The challenge is it's your challenge, is you have to tell me an interesting story from Syria. And every human story is an interesting story. I use an example of, he's my godfather in journalism. There's a guy called James Meek. James Meek used to write for The Guardian, and now he's a novelist and writes for the London Review of Books. Apologies for insulting Holland, but he wrote about the most boring character in the history of foreign journalism. He wrote about a Dutch postwoman, a woman delivering. I mean, how is that more boring? It's like he didn't go to a war zone. He just wrote about the Dutch post service. And his piece was so amazing because he found this Dutch woman, this woman living in Amsterdam, because they privatized the postal service. She doesn't deliver the post, so she has her house filled with letters. How did that journalist find this woman who is just hiding the letters in her house? And through that woman, he told me there's something about the failure of the post service, the privatization, because he was writing this before the Royal Mail was privatized in London and everything. So for me, that's an amazing piece because, again, to go back to the risk, I take so much risk to go to tell a story on something. And here is a guy, I hated him so much for telling that story because he came to Amsterdam. It's a beautiful city. He didn't go to Aleppo. And yet he told me the most beautiful story. But the challenge of the story, I mean, how do you go about and find someone? How do you infiltrate the Dutch postal service in something like you infiltrating Al-Qaeda in Yemen? So more dangerous. So that, in a way, is the audience. You know, what do I care about the postal service in Europe? But I love the piece, and it's one of my perfect examples of telling a story, narrating a story. Please.
I have a question. You mentioned IS as being very aggressive in its media behavior, and they're also known for making a lot of very graphic images and videos about violence in a very pure form. And that has also brought about some discussion in the West about how we should treat these kind of images and these kind of videos. Should they be seen by people, or should we not include them in our news story? Should people ever watch a video of someone being decapitated? What do you think we should do with these kind of images and with this type of media?
See, I grew up in Iraq. I grew up under Saddam, and I never left the country until 2003, 2004. So I know the meaning of censorship, and I can never accept censorship, you know, and especially in this age. In this age, you kind of defeat yourself if you decide to censorship. But at the same time, we have to know that IS is manipulating the media. It's manipulating in a perfect way. Again, I was in London 2-3 weeks ago when James Foley was beheaded. The next day in London, if you see every single front page of every single British newspaper, they had the picture that IS took. And in a way, it was a perfect picture of, you know, there is the defiant victim, there is the criminal standing with the knife, there's the perfect horizon, the blue sky, the colors, the composition is perfect. If a photographer is sent there to take that picture, he would take that picture. So, but that was their message. Now, how do you deal with it? Do you play it? Do you manipulate it? You have to understand that everything they are doing is not the truth. In the same way that the American military would try to push their own message. Every organization tried to send their own message. And of course, you would always take the message with doubt. I don't think censorship is the solution. Absolutely not. I think censorship defeats itself, and you can't censor pictures in this modern age. But how do you counter this propaganda in, I don't know, telling the truth in one way or another, kind of finding your own way of discrediting that propaganda machine, but not censorship. Please.
Perhaps kind of related, but have you ever had things that you felt were sort of too gruesome to show to others, make pictures that you felt like you shouldn't publish, or stories that you thought like I shouldn't release this to the public?
When I first started in journalism and photography, I started as a news photographer. So I was in Baghdad, there were car bombs, and you end up working like a fireman. So you sit in your jeans, carrying your cameras, and you're waiting, and then there is an explosion, and you go to the balcony, look for the smoke, and you chase it. In the beginning, you start by being very graphic. So there is a car bomb, there are scenes of death, there is a leg, there is something. You start taking pictures of these things because you are trying to capture everything and tell everything. And then eventually, you realize that seeing like death itself or the goriness of an image of a car bomb is not enough to portray the destruction. It's actually might have people would not look into these pictures. So Yes, in the beginning I was trying to capture this goriness, and then I realized it has no meaning, it has no dignity in death, it has nothing. So again, to go to the suggestion, how do you tell the story of the carnage of a car bomb, but not trying to be very graphic about it? There is another question which goes back to the censorship. There is debate about, should we let the reader see horrible scenes? Should the people wake up in the morning and see the scenes of destruction? Yes. Yes, an American reader should see what is happening in Baghdad, because again, we go back to the taxpayer money. It's your taxpayer that is, you know, putting the wheels of a armored vehicle. So the reader should see everything. But how do you become smart in not letting the people become bored of reading again and again? So, please.
In a slightly different vein of the censorship, I think until these videos of the beheadings were really released, the whole issue of hostages was not very prominent in the media, and how you have like only a few countries, the US and UK, who aren't paying the ransom, and kind of the issue with that, and how a lot of other countries are kind of hashing out also the funds, the amount of money they're paying out to get their people back, and how many people are being taken. I personally haven't seen very much about that in the media at all. Would you say that that, to a degree, is also maybe being censored, and why?
It's not being censored, but there is a code amongst us journalists, a sort of a code of, code of conduct that we don't talk about other colleagues being. So many of us know many details about negotiations, about what happens when a colleague is kidnapped. I was kidnapped, and I know many people knew a lot of the details that they didn't write. So for us, we try to not write about these things, because this is about the life of someone. You know, if I write the details about your kidnapping and the negotiations that happen with that, that might, cause a lot of problems. But yes, there must be debate. A debate about, do you pay money, you don't pay money, how do you get a hostage, how do you negotiate, and all these things. But it's not censorship as much as it's the journalists amongst themselves don't write about these things because they know it can cause problems. And, yeah. Well, see, I'm very objective until it comes to my family and my tribe, and then there is nothing wrong with them. But no, I mean, apart from joking, it's very difficult to become objective. I mean, it's almost impossible. I mean, you have to have set of beliefs. So, I don't know, I have a position towards violence. So I always am inclined to write against violence. So that sometimes makes me not an objective person, because I should see things with objectivity. But also at the same time, I think there is a very clear line, and you would see this line whenever you walk. Every story has its own compass that comes with it, and it's very easy to find it. Sometimes it's very difficult, because your system wants to tell you that this ugly person is an evil occupation force person, and you're inclined to write against it. But then you have to be against yourself. You have to question yourself. You have to work hard against yourself to become objective. But I think Martha comes from a different era. Martha Gellhorn was covering, the Second World War. Martha Gellhorn went to the concentration camp. There was no way in the 1940s where you can be objective towards, the Nazis. That's a different era. Now it's a different conflict. Yes, you must be objective about ISIS. It's essential to be objective about ISIS. It's a very good question. Can I answer this? It's an amazing, amazing question. How do we be objective about ISIS? Here is a group of people beheading, killing, committing genocide, committing rape, committing all these things that they say they've been doing. We don't say it, they are saying we're doing all these things. Can you become objective about it? You have to, otherwise you will not understand the conflict. You have to put yourself in the shoes of a Dutch person who decided to leave beautiful Amsterdam and go join ISIS. Why? There must be something about ISIS that allows this person to go there. It's very easy to say, oh, those guys are psychopaths, are crazy and something, they're murderers and they are doing these things. But that's not understanding the story. you know, in my last trip, I went with militias in the north of Baghdad. Those guys, I sat with them, and they are willing to commit genocide. They were not ISIS. They were, Shia militias. They are willing to commit genocide. They were telling me they were willing to commit genocide. But I have to be objective toward their fears. I can't condemn anyone. And it's not our job to condemn. There are so many other people can condemn, and it's their job. Your job is to try to understand ISIS. Yes, objective. If you go to write a story about ISIS with the preconceived conception that ISIS is a criminal organization, terrorist, whatever you want to call it, and I'm going to write bad things about them, don't go. It's a waste of your time and your efforts and stuff. So many people are saying these things already on YouTube, on whatever, on Twitter, on Facebook. Your job is to take your head out and go and try to understand ISIS. And I go to South Yemen to meet Al-Qaeda in South Yemen. I've never used the word terrorist, because it's not my job to say they are terrorists or not terrorists. My job is to say why they are in South Yemen to do what they're doing. Oh, because my job is to tell you what is happening there. My job is to narrate to you, to tell you the story of so-and-so person who decided to go and commit mass murder in a scale so big. Why is that person doing it? Because if we don't understand it, if we don't understand this society, the socio-political, the culture, if we don't understand the religion of that person, we will end up in this cycle, the cycle of every 5 years send the F-16 to bomb Iraq, because there is a new group of people who are doing something. So this is why I became a journalist. I wasn't a journalist, by the way. I didn't study journalism. I was an architect. And I was doing architecture, and I loved architecture, and I hated anything else but architecture. But one day, on the 9th of April, 2003, I saw American tanks walking down my street. So I followed these American tanks, and I went into a square in the middle of Baghdad. Now, you have to imagine my life living under Saddam. There's no newspapers, there's nothing, there's no outside world. I didn't even have a satellite TV. And I went and I stood in the square, and I saw the Americans pulling down the statue, and I was so excited that next day I decided to go into Saddam's palace and see how did this guy live. And then I went there. In the way, I was stopped by the Americans. Who are you? I said, I'm a journalist. And this is how I became a journalist. And then I met journalists from The Guardian, and they said, who are you? And I lied, and I said, I'm a journalist for a Lebanese newspaper. And of course I was lying. And I ended up working as their translator. And after 6-7 months of translating, I started taking my own pictures and started telling the stories. But that's why I became a journalist, because to pass checkpoints. See, I think all Iraqis are pessimists, so it's not only your parents. But I'm also a pessimist, and I think we are getting into a different cycle of violence. I mean, I've never been as pessimist as I've ever been in the last 11 years, because I think the conflict now has taken a different shape, a shape that is, before, even when it was a civil war, it was a civil war between two warring militias. So, say one neighborhood, there is A people on this side, B people on this side, but then in between they have the militias fighting. Now it's the communities that are rejecting each other. So the level of hatred, the level of the potential of genocide is big, is huge. But on the same time, I also don't think it's a vicious cycle. There is nothing called vicious cycle. It's one of these journalistic cliches to understand the Middle East. You say it's a vicious cycle. No, the reasons are there. The components of the conflicts are there. It's very easy to deal with it. Not very easy, it's very difficult to deal with it. It will take a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of education, solving the issues that's creating the injustice. So in my last trip to Iraq, I went to Ramadi. Ramadi is a Sunni town that was in a rebellion against the Shia government of Iraq. So the conflict was very easy. Sunnis in rebellion against the Shia. Now, the conflict in Ramadi had its roots in the injustice imposed by the Sunnis on other Sunnis. because there was wealth that was not distributed, there was different issues. So that is not a vicious cycle. That has its specific reason. Deal with the specific reason. And then the Iraqi government, now it's a democratically elected government, everything. Yet it is one of the most oppressive governments in the Middle East, regardless of it's the torture in the prisons and all these things. So the reasons of the violence are there. It's not a vicious cycle. It's not because we are crazy in Iraq, which we are sometimes. Very weird creatures, those journalists, because you hate each other, you compete with each other, but you have respect, and you tend in the time of violence to work as a pack. So you find a group of friends that, my most comfortable working arrangement is if I work with 3 other photographers, journalists. Because remember, there is this kind of very false notion that you have to be the only person in that place, which is very, very stupid. In this room, everyone can write a different story about this one single event, and your challenge is to tell that story in a different way, in a more creative way, and something. So all the notions that create this jealousy between journalists are, based on jealousy, basically. But it's not very true. And when you work in a conflict situation, you will see yourself taking care of others. I was covering the riots in Istanbul. And so we're competing. We're all photographers, 20, 25 photographers. But we all had one, WhatsApp kind of group. And everyone would tell everyone where is the violence happening. So everyone would go there. Because it's kind of part of you share your information. There is no sense of, it's a false, this whole sense of trying to have the only person. Yes. See, I have a friend who I was having a conversation with a few days ago in Istanbul, and he said, if we can catch this monster that's called Western media, we would kill it and get rid of it. And there is nothing called Western media. There is something called, The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Figaro, BBC. They are not Western media. Now, there is a way of thinking which is a narrative that prevails, and your job is to question that prevailing narrative. That's something. But there is nothing called Western media or media in general, especially now in this Twitter and Facebook. And I don't think the media or the West is encouraging ISIS to do anything. It's like, mashallah, they're doing it out of their own, kind of wit. So, no. Again, I go back to the challenge of ISIS. ISIS is different. Is different from anything I have dealt with before, because I am dealing with people who don't need me as a journalist. Why would they need a journalist to come tell their side of the story if they can't tell their side of the story? So suddenly, they don't need us. They can kidnap us or kill us. Because before, even Osama bin Laden needed the press, and he would give interviews, and he would allow the press to come, Western press, American press, British press, Arabic press, because he needed to get his message out. Every person needs their message out, and they use the media, and they try to manipulate the media. I'm not talking about the Dutch Foreign Ministry. But now, they don't need us anymore. Osama bin Laden doesn't need, or the new Osama bin Laden doesn't need, Ghaith Abdul-Ahad or you or something. He can get his message out. So this is why we are dealing in a different age, in an age of how do you find your purpose, and how can you tell the story of ISIS? I personally only write in English. I don't write in Arabic, so which is, it's a shame. But I think, for example, sometimes I write in something called the London Review of Books, which gives me more space, so I can talk in more details about something. So I don't think I would change my message if I'm writing in an Arabic context or in a Western. So, I've done films, and the films have been translated to Arabic, so no, it's the same message. I think the Middle East itself suffers from lack of independent media outlets. And that is the biggest problem in the Middle East, because if you look at the, there are brilliant journalists in the Middle East who write in Arabic, but there is no, or rarely there exists this independent media outlet. I mean, we see Jazeera, we see Arabiya, we see all these things, but they're, all to a certain extent manipulated. So that is the challenge of the Middle East, of having independent media outlets.
Then how would you talk a lot about changing the story and not basically continuing on the same sort of tangent as a lot of media portrays, because you said they all follow this sort of same thing. But then for someone that is not really involved in the conflict, how would you change that story if all you've received is the same narrative? How would you, because like it's...
We're talking about the journalist or the reader?
From the from the reader's perspective, if you're reading all these things, and then how is it that you want to pass on this knowledge or to take a different standpoint? It's very difficult to be objective in a sense when it's so manipulated.
But it's not manipulated. I mean, we're talking about the IS message being manipulated, or we're talking about the Western media manipulating? Well, I don't think the Western media manipulate things because they have this hidden agenda and there is this kind of big room where all the editors of all the Western media sit and they connive and they make the plots. I don't think that happens. I think simplicity doesn't come from a plot. Simplicity comes because it's easier to understand a narrative if you reduce it to a black and white. So rather than you have the Western media plotting to deceive the reader, I think it's certain conflicts get too complicated, simplify the narrative, and then everyone starts following this narrative. And then it's your job, if you want to distinguish yourself as a journalist, is you have to move away from the pack and try to tell what is really going on. Maybe that is the truth. Maybe the truth is what everyone is saying. But maybe the truth is sometimes a little bit to the left or a little bit to the right. Or try to, within that big truth, tell the narrative. The Iraq War, for example, like I mean, I wasn't involved in the media then in 2003, but I think that was bordering criminality. When every single media outlet in a lot of the world, in the West and different parts of the world, you're raising a very important thing that I strongly, believe in. I think it's even with the presence of social media, even with the presence of the Syrian opposition taking their own pictures, the role of a journalist as an arbiter of truth is still important. Maybe it's a very obnoxious thing to say. Maybe it's not a democratic thing to say. But an opposition, an activist somewhere, his job or her job is to be an activist, is to push their own narrative of the story, even if they were on the side of the truth. But that is their narrative of the story. So your job is to tell if this narrative is true or not. And I think the Arab Spring has created this, at least in the beginning, this notion that Twitter, Facebook, we can use that, those are great young people, hey, and let's use them as a source of information to write these beautiful articles about the activists and whatsoever. We've discovered now that this is not true. This is not accurate because many of those people, A, did not represent their society, B, they were a minority, C, manipulated the media outlets for so I would go back, even in the presence of social media outlets, your role is much more important. But that takes us to a second part of the social media thing. It's a good time now. I'm very optimistic about journalism because there are many more media outlets. There was a monopoly by the so-called Western, quote-unquote Western media, a monopoly by the establishment, by The Guardian, The New York Times, The Times. Now that monopoly has been broken. There are fantastic new media outlets, Medium, something else. All these are creating a space for you to tell a story, which in a typical kind of market analysis, it tells you that there are people who are very interested in the long story. They want to hear the narrative. They want to read the 10,000 words beyond this simple, frontline situation. So social media is a very, very dangerous tool, my dear. You know, before you had like 4 guys sitting in the street in Baghdad and say, oh, kill the Sunnis, kill the Shia. But now those 4 guys can say it and they can have, I don't know, hundreds of millions of people listen to them. The hate rhetoric has been exasperated by, I mean, the hate always existed. You know, Jewish, Arab, Sunni, Shia, Christian, the hatred existed. Now it's being broadcasted. And that is and that takes us back to IS kind of manipulating of the truth. You know, it's a product of that. I try to give them love. No, I mean, it's very, it becomes very annoying. Sometimes it gets on you, and you have to be very careful. You have to be very careful for your own mental health, because I've seen it happen. You know, I've seen it happen. It happened to me. It happened to other people. It affects you. It kind of scars you. You know, once you see a car bomb, your life is different. Like your life before a car bomb is different from, like, you are scarred. Khalas, that's it. Then, but how you deal with the scars and how you try to, you know, do a healing process. And also, if you continue to do it, you come to hate the people you're writing about. You know, you come to hate all those crazy gunmen who are again and again and again destroying their cities. Can they see? So you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't hate, and you should take care of yourself. What is the solution? Different people deal with it different way, but I think the most important thing is to take care of your health. No, it's, how do you go back to the same situation? It's a very difficult question. I mean, you learn, because when you're kidnapped, basically, at least in my kind of case, it's when you have failed in doing your homework. So I failed twice, and twice I was captured or kidnapped because I didn't do my homework very well, because I decided to rush, because I, you know, didn't build enough local infrastructure, people that can protect me. So you learn from your mistakes. I mean, Libya for me was a turning point. After 2 weeks in solitary confinement, I started questioning my method of working. What did I do wrong? And then after that, you know, I went to Syria, I went back to Libya, I looked for the jailer and I wrote a story about him. So you learn from and sometimes you decide you don't want to deal with these situations. But sometimes some journalists, it's not their fault when they're betrayed. So many of this, you know, the journalists who were kidnapped in Syria were betrayed. And that's not the fault of the journalist. I'm talking about my personal, once in Afghanistan, once in Libya, that was my personal, you know, I didn't do my homework. I wanted to go to Tripoli. I thought like Tripoli will fall next week. I have to be there, you know, let's take the car, let's push the road. And that was a stupid mistake. So. Kind of be slow, you know, don't go, I mean, nothing will change, you know, but if you get kidnapped, things can be very bad. So I decided, okay, I need to go slow. So instead of 1 week to prepare for a trip, then make it 3, 4, 5 weeks. Before I would say, yalla, let's go for the road, and then something will happen, and then we'll deal with it. Now I don't do these things. But there is no perfect formula, because in the end of the day, you are taking the craziest decision on planet Earth, that you decide to hand yourself to the trust of someone to drive you down a road that you don't know. You pretend that you have safety mechanism or something, but that's all depends on a trust. And I would lie to you if I say I don't go back because I need that. I'll be lying, because I was in Aleppo in 2012 and I was under the shelling, and I don't think I've ever slept as peacefully as then, because your whole life disappears. You're only there at the front line, sleeping on a mattress, the house is shaking, you might die, so you don't think of anything. You don't have anxiety, you don't think of your girlfriend, you don't think of your mortgage, you don't think of anything else. It's only you in this life and death situation. So life becomes very simple, which is part of the appeal of IS, because life is very simple for them. So I would lie to say if I say that war doesn't have a tickling appeal. But it's a stupid appeal, and your job is to resist that appeal, and you have to resist that rush, that excitement, because that is a drug not different from crack cocaine or anything else. It's a very crazy thing, and you should resist it. Why do you go back there? Because you can tell a story, because that's your job. Your job is to tell a story, and you think you can tell a story. I mean, again, I don't think there is a difference between telling a story of, there isn't a story that's better than any other story. So I don't think that if you tell the story of the Taliban, then that makes you a good journalist. But if you tell a story in your neighborhood, in, I don't know, in Amsterdam, then you're a bad journalist. I think the greatest stories that I have read are the stories that are written in New York or in London that addresses a social issue. So you don't have to go to Mogadishu to tell about a war zone. You can tell it in your own street, and that's, you know, so that is your role. But also you have to resist this temptation of the front line. It's a crazy temptation. And many people die. You either die in the beginning of your job or you die in the end of your job. It's, and it's, yeah, because many people think they are, I mean, I could have, out of sheer stupidity, I could have died, you know, 100 times in Iraq in the beginning. I would do things like, because I didn't know these things. But eventually, you know it. Why do you say a journalist? Because I like to be a journalist. I mean, it's a simple thing. Why not become a chef? I would like to become a chef, but I think I'm very intrigued by. I don't go this. This is a confession. Can you switch off the camera, please? I don't go to these places because I would like to tell the bigger audience about what's happening there. I go there because I am very curious. I go to a certain place because I want to find the answer for myself. And one of the dangers of journalism is when you stop being curious or you stop being intrigued by something. This is when you start falling as a journalist. This is when you become a jaded journalist or something. So I go to these places because I am personally interested in the answer to this. Now, if I write a story and so that's fantastic. But personally, sometimes I go because I want to know the answer. The line is very clear. There is a very clear line between doing your job as a journalist or being a human being. I doubt there is any person who will stand in this kind of situation and say you're crossing a street with sniper fire and then there's an old woman and you would not help the old woman but rather take a picture. So the line is very clear in this kind of situations. So yeah, you leave your camera and start helping people. Or sometimes there are people there helping, so it's your job to take pictures. So sometimes your job is not to help people. Sometimes your job is to take pictures because there are other, you know, people doing that job for you. Well, if you can do it, my dear, go by all means and do it. If I can do it, I would do it tomorrow. If I can infiltrate any organization, I would do it. You know, in many places I had to, how do we put this in a nice way? I had to pretend that I am something that I'm not to get that story. So is this lying? Maybe, but this is you doing a job. You are doing an undercover. Now, of course, you shouldn't do crazy things. You shouldn't use violence. You shouldn't use weapons. You shouldn't do anything. You shouldn't even say things that you don't believe in. But if you can get into a situation, then do it by all means. I mean, this is our job, basically. We are getting into a situation. So, I mean, again, the lines are very clear. The lines are very clear between what is undercover work and what is, you know, pure deceit. You know, so in the British press, they have this deceit a lot, you know, these kind of the tabloids when they kind of lie and tell a story just to to make someone tell a story. That is not journalism. But if you can, I don't know, if you want to infiltrate, if you want to tell a story about, you know, a drug gang in somewhere in Europe, and you want to pretend that you're someone who is not you in real life, that is your job as a journalist. There is something in journalism, I quote someone who told me this, to be a journalist is to seduce and betray, because you want to seduce this militia to give you access to tell their story, but then you will have to betray them. If you're a good journalist, you will have to betray them. If you're a good journalist, you will have to make the people angry with you. Because the leftists that I was telling you about, I thought I was doing them the biggest, you know, who would write about like a tiny little thing? And they were accused of being, you know, agents of the police. And I told their story, and I told how, you know, not honest, decent, but how earnest people they were. They were very angry with me. They thought like I made them look as, you know, kids and gangs and something, who they were. But so it hurt me that those people kind of didn't like my story that I did earnestly to help, not to help them, but to tell the truth. But that's my job. My job is not to make people feel happy about me. My job is to tell what is there and what's been happening.